War on Blue Water, Naval War of 1812, Illustrated. A production of the American Society of Marine Artists. War on Blue Water, Part 2. The British Blockade of American Ports and Economic Lockdown. The British began to blockade American ports at the end of 1812. With so much of its Navy force dedicated to the European theater and so little to spare for the American matters, a British blockade was the most effective way to bottle up the American Navy and maritime commerce and thereby cripple the American economy. The British government announced its first official blockade on November 27, 1812, to cover the mouths of the Chesapeake Bay and the Delaware River, cutting off Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Norfolk, along with many other port towns located along those bodies of water. Aware of the hostility to the war in much of New England, and the fact that its ships were still providing vital food supplies to the British Army in the Iberian Peninsula, the British expanded the blockade south of New England on March 26, 1813, to include areas around New York City, Savannah, Charleston, and Port Royal, South Carolina, and the Mississippi River. 8 months later, on November 16, 1813, the British increased the blockade to cover the entire U.S. coast from Long Island Sound to the southern limit of Georgia and around the mouth of the Mississippi River. And finally, on April 25, 1814, it was extended to include the entire New England coast. In Europe, the Long War was coming to an end. The victorious British and their allies marched into Paris on March 30, 1814, and within a week Napoleon abdicated. As the Napoleonic Wars wound down, the British were able to direct more military assets to the American theater. So over a period of a year and a half, as the blockade noose tightened, blue water activity for American commerce and the U.S. Navy greatly diminished. But fast merchantmen continued to run the blockade, and there were a number of occasions when American naval vessels either ran the blockade or came out to engage the blockaders. The first of these was a disaster for the Americans. James Lawrence had been promoted to captain following his victory in the U.S. sloop of war Hornet over the H.M. brig Peacock, and was given command of the U.S. frigate Chesapeake. It was in Boston Harbor where the blockade had not yet been formally proclaimed, but was effectively bottled up by the H.M. frigate Shannon under Captain Philip Bowes Verbroek. He had taken a page from the American book and rigorously trained his crew in gunnery, and for 56 days captured and burned merchantmen attempting to enter Boston Harbor. He hoped to provoke Lawrence into a fight. On June 1, 1813, Lawrence had determined to rid Boston Harbor of the British frigate and put to sea flying a banner that read, "Free Trade and Sailors' Rights." The two vessels met at 5:30 in the afternoon in the waters between Cape Ann and Cape Cod. When the engagement opened, Lawrence had the clear advantage. The Chesapeake had the weather gauge and every opportunity to rake the Shannon. Instead, Lawrence preferred to battle the Shannon broadside to broadside. While Lawrence's decision earned him praise for gallantry among the British officer corps, in the end it cost him dearly. The initial exchange of broadsides began at approximately 6 p.m., and the Shannon achieved greater success with each successive broadside. Within 13 minutes, the Chesapeake's wheel had been blown away, the helmsman killed, the deck swept with grape shot, and Captain Lawrence had been badly wounded. As Lawrence was being carried below, he gave his last and most famous order, when he directed his crew, "Don't give up the ship." Just months later, this command was flown at the peak on Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry's flagship, the Lawrence, in the victorious Battle of Lake Erie, and ever since has been closely identified with the Navy. The flag now hangs in a place of honor at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. The Chesapeake's crew tried their best to obey Lawrence's order, but it was to no avail. The American frigate was trapped against Shannon's starboard bow, and Broke gave the order for his crew to board the Chesapeake. In intense hand-to-hand combat, the British crew seemed to gain the advantage before the American crew rallied and began to push the invaders back. It was at this point that Broke, who had led the boarding party himself, was cut down by a cutlass thrust to his head after being clubbed by a musket. But the Shannon's crew rallied around their fallen captain, and the Americans were forced to surrender the Chesapeake. Although Broke's wounds were pronounced fatal, he survived his wounds, but he never commanded a ship again. The engagement between the two vessels was short. The entire affair lasted no more than 15 minutes, but it was an extremely bloody confrontation. Aboard the Chesapeake, 60 men were dead and another 60 were wounded, including Captain Lawrence, who died from his wounds 3 days later. He was 32 years old. The casualties aboard Shannon were also heavy, with 23 men killed and 56 wounded. The British claimed the Chesapeake as a prize and sailed her to Halifax, where her crew were made prisoners and the frigate itself was repaired and entered into the British Navy. The defeat of the Chesapeake was the first victory over an American frigate and was welcome news for the British. Shortly after the loss of the Chesapeake, the U.S. brig Argus under Lieutenant William Henry Allen broke through the blockade of New York Harbor on June 18, 1813. The vessel had seen extensive action in the First Barbary War, including the amphibious attack on the city of Derna, immortalized in the Marines' hymn Shores of Tripoli, and now was charged with bringing William Crawford to France as the American minister to the First Empire. Shortly after completing that mission, the newly promoted Master Commandant Allen took the Argus on a series of audacious raids in the English Channel and the Irish Sea. In the month of July 1813, the Argus captured 19 British merchant vessels and, not having extra crew to man the prizes, Allen burned most. The actions of the Argus spiked British maritime insurance rates and prompted the British Admiralty to order all available ships to hunt down the American brig. Finally, in the Irish Sea off St. David's Head in Wales, the HM brig Pelican, under Commander John Fortis Maple, put an end to Allen and the Argus. Both American and British reports of the incident suggest that the success of the Argus was her own undoing, for the day before the battle she had taken prize, a Portuguese wine merchant, and indulged in its cargo to celebrate before torching the ship. Early in the morning of August 14th, the Pelican spotted the smoke and closed. Instead of fleeing the more heavily armed Pelican, Allen chose to fight, but his gunnery was not up to par and things went badly for him. The captured ship and crew were taken to Portsmouth, England, where Allen died of his wounds, but, in keeping with the practices of the day, the British honored his valor and buried him with full military honors. Three weeks later, the U.S. brig Enterprise 16 engaged and captured the HM brig Boxer 14 off the coast of Maine, then part of Massachusetts. This victory was particularly significant because the British capture of the Chesapeake and death of its commander, Lawrence, 3 months before, had dampened American spirits that had risen from a series of unprecedented single-ship frigate victories in the opening months of the war. For the British, the defeat of the Chesapeake was reassurance that, indeed, they did rule the seas. Perception then, as now, was an important aspect of warfare, and in this regard, the success of the Enterprise was doubly important because it buoyed American spirits, and unlike all previous Blue Water engagements, many Americans witnessed this battle since it was fought close to the shore. But this engagement is also interesting because it provides a window into the standards of chivalry that existed in that age, and, thanks to a British court-martial held after a hard-fought defeat, one gains a number of insights into the discrepancies between the navies of the two adversaries. Under the command of Lieutenant Samuel Blythe, the HM brig Boxer, armed with 12 18-pounder carronades and 2 6-pounder long guns, patrolled the coastal waters of Maine during the summer of 1813 and had taken 7 prizes, all mostly small coastal vessels. The morning of September 5th, the Boxer was at anchor near Permaquid Point, a few miles east of Portland. A couple of her officers had been rowed ashore by some of the crew that fine fall morning to shoot pigeons, so the Boxer's complement was missing a dozen men. When the U.S. brig Enterprise, under Lieutenant William Burroughs, and armed with slightly more guns, 14 18-pounder carronades and 2 9-pounder long guns, was sighted, the two vessels made for each other. As they did, Lieutenant Blythe had his flag nailed to the mast, stating that it would remain there so long as there was life in his body. But the winds were light and occasionally calm, so it was not until mid-afternoon that they met. At 3:15, not a half a pistol range apart, the engagement commenced with exchanges of broadsides. Commander Blythe was killed instantly when an 18-pound round shot tore through his body, and at the same time, Lieutenant Burroughs on the Enterprise was mortally wounded with a musket ball. Command devolved to Lieutenant David McCreary on the Boxer and Lieutenant Edward McCall on the Enterprise. At 3:30, the Enterprise ranged ahead and rounded the Boxer so as to rake her from stem to stern. That destruction was compounded when the Boxer lost her topmast and topsail yard, and it was continued as the Enterprise poured broadside after broadside into her. At 3:45, unable to strike the colors nailed to the mast, she hailed her surrender. The mortally wounded American captain, Lieutenant Burroughs, would not go below for medical attention until he received the sword of his adversary. When he did, he stated, "I am satisfied, I die contented." In addition to the loss of the two commanders, the Americans suffered 11 wounded, 1 mortally, out of their crew of 102 men, and the British lost 2 killed and 17 wounded, of which 4 would die from their crew of 66. Civility and chivalry, which existed far more than tales of bloodshed and destruction would lead one to believe, can be seen in this minor, 30-minute naval encounter in the middle of the war. Royal Navy Lieutenant Blythe had just served as a pallbearer for the fallen American hero, Captain James Lawrence, when the British buried him in Halifax with full military honors following the capture of his ship, the Chesapeake, in June 1813. Lawrence eventually was reinterred at Trinity Church in Lower Manhattan, where his monument can still be seen today. Demonstrating these attributes again while patrolling the coast of Maine on the Boxer, Lieutenant Blythe took a coastal vessel only to find it manned by a group of ladies out for a sail. Bringing them on board the Boxer, he admonished them for taking such risks and sent them home in their vessel. Upon learning of this chivalry, the husband of one of the women, an American officer in the local militia, published an accounting of the event and expressed his appreciation to Lieutenant Blythe in the local newspaper. Further evidence of honor, respect, and civility was seen in the elaborate funeral ceremonies for the two commanders. They were given full military honors and laid side by side in the Portland Eastern Cemetery. Later, an Enterprise sailor died from his wounds and was buried next to the two captains. British Captain Blythe was 29 years old, and the American Captain Burroughs was 28. The story inspired the poem by Portland resident Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, My Lost Youth, part of which reads, I remember the sea fight far away, how it thundered o'er the tide, and the dead captains, as they lie in their graves, o'erlooking the tranquil bay, where they in battle died. Later, at a banquet in New York City celebrating the victory, the following toast was offered. To the crew of the Boxer, enemies by law, but by gallantry, brothers. The British court-martial accused 4 men of the Boxer crew of deserting their gun, but also concluded that the Boxer, just launched a year before the battle, was of poor construction compared to the similar-sized but much heavier Enterprise. The U.S. Navy agreed and did not take the captured vessel into service, but put it up for auction. The court also noted that the British gunnery training was inadequate, that the ordnance, particularly the British carronade, was inferior in design to the American equivalent, and that the Boxer's crew, significantly smaller than the American crew, was further handicapped when command devolved upon Lieutenant McCreary by the absence of his fellow officers who were off birding. Early in the war, the naval architect William Doty, who would continue as a leading naval architect after the war, designing 74-gun ships of the line for the Navy, created a new, heavily built class of sloops of war. 3 of these were built in 1813. The Frolic, launched in September in Charleston, Massachusetts, the Peacock, also launched in September in New York City, and the Wasp, commissioned in early 1814 in Newburyport, New Hampshire. 2 of these new ships would extract a heavy toll on the British Navy and commerce. The U.S. sloop of war Frolic 22, under Commander Joseph Bainbridge, slipped the Boston blockade in February 1814 and went south to harass British shipping in the West Indies during the late winter and early spring. After limited success, she encountered on April 20th, 1814, the H.M. frigate Orpheus 32 and the H.M. schooner Shelburne 6, formerly the American privateer Racer. Heavily outmatched, Commander Joseph Bainbridge attempted escape into a neutral harbor and cast the ship's guns and anchors overboard to lighten her, but it was to no avail. The Orpheus caught the Frolic 15 miles from the sanctuary of a Cuban port, and Bainbridge was forced to surrender the sloop without a fight. She was taken into the Royal Navy and renamed H.M. Sloop of War Florida. The Frolic was lost, but she had 2 new sister ships, the U.S. sloop of war Peacock and the U.S. sloop of war Wasp. The latter was the 5th U.S. Navy ship to bear this name. One of her predecessors was the U.S. sloop of war Wasp that took the H.M. brig Frolic in October 1812, only to be captured by a British 74 immediately thereafter. The British renamed that Wasp the H.M. sloop of war Peacock when the U.S. sloop of war Hornet sunk the H.M. brig Peacock on February 24, 1813. And 2 weeks later, as if this genealogy were not complicated enough already, the U.S. Congress authorized construction of the U.S. sloop of war Peacock. It was this U.S. sloop of war Peacock 22, under Master Commandant Lewis Warrington, that had slipped out of New York Harbor on March 12, 1814. After cruising the Bahamas for British merchantmen, she encountered the H.M. sloop of war Iberville, under Commander Richard Wales, on April 28, 1814, in the waters off Cape Canaveral, Florida. The 2 vessels sailed for each other, and in the 45-minute engagement that ensued, the Americans proved superior in their gunnery once again. The Peacock and the Iberville were armed primarily with carronades, so the battle was fought at close range. The first broadsides the ships exchanged were aimed at the rigging, out of character for both, but afterwards, the Americans began to direct their fire at the hull of the Iberville. The Peacock's guns punched almost 50 holes into the Iberville, and the British ship quickly took on water. Commander Wales mustered the crew and ordered them to board the Peacock, but the crew refused. A quarter of their shipmates were already casualties, and the men of the Iberville knew that losses aboard the Peacock must have been light. Only 2 men had been wounded on the American ship. Wales had little choice and struck his colors. The Americans took the Iberville as a prize and, managing to prevent the ship from sinking, found over $100,000 worth in specie aboard the British vessel. Both ships safely reached Savannah, Georgia, and the prize entered the service of the U.S. Navy as the U.S. sloop of war Iberville. The new Wasp surpassed the success of the Peacock. From June to September 1814, the Wasp sank 2 British brigs and captured another, while also taking numerous merchant vessels as prizes. The Wasp, under Master Commandant Johnston Blakely, had orders to harass British shipping in the English Channel, much like the Argus had done the previous year. After capturing 7 British merchants, the Wasp sighted on June 28, 1814, the H.M. brig Reindeer, 18, bearing down on her. The Reindeer, under Commander William Manners, had specific orders to hunt down and capture the Wasp. Unfortunately for Manners and the Reindeer, the Wasp was far stronger, mounting more and heavier guns. As the two vessels approached one another, the wind nearly died, leaving the Wasp and Reindeer to fight in near-calm waters. After exchanging several broadsides, it was apparent to Manners that his smaller guns could not match the Wasp, and he ordered his men to board the American. The crew of the Wasp beat back several boarding attempts before Commandant Blakely ordered his own men to attempt a boarding. The Americans quickly overwhelmed the crew of the Reindeer, and the only surviving British officer, the captain's clerk, surrendered the ship. The British lost more than half their number, while American losses were slight, 11 killed and 15 more wounded. The damage to the Reindeer was severe, so Blakely had her burned. After putting into port for repairs at Lorient, France, Blakely returned to the English Channel and captured several merchant brigs before encountering the HM brig Avon on August 27th. Like the Reindeer, the Avon was outgunned by the Wasp, and, as in so many other naval engagements of the War of 1812, superior American gunnery made short work of the British brig. Within a half hour of exchanging their opening broadsides, the crew of the Wasp had partially dismasted the Avon, hauled the hull several times, dismounted a number of her carronades, and made a third of Avon's men casualties. In contrast, the Wasp's hull had been hit but a few times, and only 3 men had been wounded. The Avon surrendered, but before the brig could be claimed as a prize, 3 British vessels, drawn by the gunfire, chased the Wasp off. Even if the Wasp had not been forced to flee, the damage to the Avon was so severe that she sank shortly after the American brig had left. The Wasp continued in the Channel, harassing shipping, and eventually captured one more Royal Navy vessel, the lightly armed HM brig Atalanta. With only 8 guns, she surrendered without a fight on September 21, 1814. The small ship sailed under a prize crew for the United States and reached Savannah, Georgia, November 4, 1814. When the Atalanta left the company of the Wasp, that was the last anyone heard of the American sloop. Blakely had planned to sail for Rio de Janeiro, but the ship was lost with all hands crossing the Atlantic. American naval activity on blue water diminished in 1813 and 1814 as the British blockade of American ports tightened. One of the best examples of this was when Commander Stephen Decatur took his squadron, consisting of the frigates United States and Macedonian and the brig Hornet, north from New York City through the treacherous tidewaters of Hell's Gate to gain the open ocean through Long Island Sound in order to avoid a British squadron patrolling in the waters south of the city off Sandy Hook. Sailors must have viewed this as an ill omen when first the United States grounded in Hell's Gate, but was freed in the next tide cycle, and then when a bolt of lightning struck the peak of its mainmast, brought down Decatur's broad pendant, shot down the mass into the hull, shocked but did not kill members of the crew, and blasted copper plates off the bottom of the ship before entering the water. On June 1, 1813, nearly 2 weeks after setting sail, the American escape was thwarted by a strong British presence waiting for them at the Atlantic entrance to the Sound, and they had to take refuge in New London up the Thames River. The Hornet managed to escape back to New York a year and a half later, but the frigates were caged there until the end of the war. The frigate's president and Congress took advantage of heavy fog and escaped Boston April 30, 1813, and parted ways once they reached the open sea. For 5 months, the president harassed British shipping in their home waters from the Azores in the south all the way to Cape North in the high latitudes of Norway. And although she captured few ships, the very presence of the now feared American heavy frigate drove British maritime insurance rates up markedly. After another cruise to the West Indies, the president was bottled up in New York City for nearly a year. As, at the beginning of the war, when it took 6 weeks for London to learn that Washington had declared war, so too at the end of the war it took time for all parties to learn that it officially ended on February 16, 1815. In fact, The last sea engagement occurred on the other side of the world 4.5 months later. During the closing months of the war, the U.S. Navy ran the blockade and engaged the enemy 4 times. On January 14, 1815, a blizzard struck the New York area and forced off station the British squadron that had bottled up the U.S. frigate President 44 under Commodore Stephen Decatur in New York for many months. Weeks before, Decatur had received orders from Navy Secretary William Jones to lead a squadron made up of the Hornet, Peacock, and Tom Bowline to harass British shipping on the other side of the world. Thus, he seized on the opportunity to run the blockade in the teeth of the storm at night. Unfortunately, pilots instructed to anchor boats bearing lights to indicate the safe passage over the sandbar at the mouth of the harbor failed to do so correctly, and as a result, the President struck the bar. For 2 hours, Decatur and his crew fought to free the frigate while the storm battered the stricken vessel. In time, they managed to get her off, but the President has sustained significant damage. On the following morning, the HM Ship of the Line Majestic, HM Frigate Pomone, HM Frigate Tenedos, and HM Frigate Endymion returned to their blockading station, spotted the President trying to escape, and pursued her. The Majestic and Endymion led the chase, with the latter quickly outpacing the former. The Endymion was a swift sailor, while the President was handicapped by the damage done by the sandbar. By that afternoon, the President was exchanging shots with the British, and by nightfall, the Endymion had closed enough to fire broadsides. But Decatur knew that other British ships were closing and time was short, so he ordered his crew to load their guns with chain shot in hopes of quickly dismasting his opponent. After 2 hours, Decatur succeeded in crippling the Endymion, but the President had been badly damaged as well. Decatur sailed the President south in hopes of escaping the other British frigates, but after 2 hours, the Pomone had closed with the President, and Decatur, fully aware of his hopeless situation, struck his colors. The Americans suffered 24 killed and 55 wounded, while the British lost 11 dead and 14 wounded, all on the Endymion. The President was the 3rd frigate that the United States Navy had lost during the war, but the frigate's defeat did little to affect the reputation of Stephen Decatur. He went on to become a member of the Board of Navy Commissioners in the capital, and, in addition to his daring do as a naval commander, is also remembered for his toast to "Our country. In her intercourse with foreign nations, may she always be in the right, but our country, right or wrong." The Endymion escorted the captured President and her crew to the Royal Naval Station in Bermuda, barely surviving a severe storm at sea. She was taken into the Royal Navy as the HM Frigate President and served until 1818, when, interestingly, she was scrapped, but only after her design was copied to build a new, identical ship with the same name that was launched in 1828. This was probably less a tribute to American naval architecture than a political statement. "Behold one of the captured American superfrigates, and remember who is the ruler of the seas." She served the Royal Navy in various capacities until 1903, when she was sold. The U.S. frigate Constitution 44 slipped the blockade mid-December 1814 and spent the month of January raiding British shipping in the West Indies. Charles Stuart commanded the Constitution, and although he had received word of the Treaty of Ghent on February 8, 1815, he knew that until Congress ratified the treaty, technically any prizes captured were still legitimate spoils of war. So he continued to do so, and on February 20th, spotted 2 sails on the horizon and gave chase. He learned that the vessels were not merchantmen, but 2 smaller Royal Navy convoy escorts, HM 6th Rate Cyane and HM 6th Rate Levant. Late in the afternoon, he engaged them. Combined, the 2 vessels equaled the firepower of the Constitution, and the British vessels began a series of broadsides aimed at the frigate. But Stuart maneuvered his ship deftly. First, he concentrated his fire against the Levant, forcing her out of action to make repairs. Then, as night fell, Stuart turned the Constitution to the Cyane, which quickly struck her colors. Stuart returned to the Levant, which was attempting to flee the engagement. The Constitution was a swift sailer and soon caught the British vessel. The Levant withstood several broadsides, but was soon forced to surrender as well. The Constitution suffered little damage in her engagement, but 12 cannonballs were found embedded in the hull of the frigate, none of which penetrated the vessel, confirming the frigate's reputation. Stuart was able to successfully make a prize of the Cyane, but he lost the Levant en route back home when the British recaptured it. In 1828, the British launched the HM frigate President. She was copied directly from the U.S. frigate President that the British had captured in 1815 and taken plans off before breaking her up. She was the sister ship of the U.S. frigate Constitution, which, coincidentally in the same year, 1828, the U.S. Navy laid up in ordinary, or mothballed, in Boston. This was not unusual for a 30-year-old wooden ship, one vastly outgunned by the Navy's new 74s coming off the ways. And a survey was ordered to determine the cost of bringing her back into service or scrapping her. Another of the original 6 frigates, the Congress, underwent the same procedure a couple of years later, and the Navy decided to break her up in 1835. This was the normal life cycle for a warship, but on September 14, 1830, an article appeared in the Boston newspaper The Advertiser reporting that Old Ironsides was bound for the scrap heap. 2 days later, the famous poem, written by a 21-year-old Harvard law student, Oliver Wendell Holmes, appeared in the same paper. Titled Old Ironsides, the 143-word work challenged the young country to go ahead and destroy the only surviving icon it had of the new nationalism that followed the War of 1812. The first stanza reads, "Aye, tear her tattered ensign down, long has it waved on high, and many an eye has danced to see that banner in the sky." This was but the first of many efforts over the generations to keep and maintain what is now the oldest commissioned naval vessel afloat in the world. The HMS Victory in Greenwich is older, but no longer floats. In addition to traditional painting and models, American fascination with this ship is seen in a variety of other ways she has been rendered in art. These include miniatures of models in watch cases and light bulbs, to one made entirely out of highly engineered steel, measuring 8.5 feet long and weighing 2/3 of a ton. And at the lighter end of the weight spectrum, there are commemorative stamps, including one issued at the beginning of the bicentennial, based on an original painting by Michel Felice Korn, currently in the collection of USS Constitution Museum in Boston. The whole story is summed up in this ancient piece of ivory in this contemporary scrimshaw etching showing the ship on her 200th birthday, under sail, being saluted by a flyover of Navy jets. Coming back to the war, in early 1815, the U.S. sloop-of-war Hornet 20, under Commandant James Biddle, eluded the blockade and worked her way to the South Atlantic to fulfill Navy Secretary William Jones's order to be part of a squadron led by U.S. frigate President to harass shipping in the East Indies. On March 23rd, the Hornet, unaware the President had been taken by the British, was near Tristan da Cunha, the world's most remote archipelago, located about halfway between Africa's Cape of Good Hope and Latin America's Cape Horn, where she found and engaged the HM brig Penguin, 19. Once more, American gunnery proved superior. In 20 minutes, the Penguin struck her colors and was so badly damaged she had to be scuttled. In contrast, the cannon fire from the Penguin did little damage. Therefore, the Hornet rendezvoused with the U.S. sloop-of-war Peacock 22 and the U.S. store ship Tom Bowline, and Commander Biddle put the Penguin prisoners on the Bowline and sent it to Rio de Janeiro and continued his mission to the East Indies. En route, they closed on the HMS Cornwallis 74, mistaking her for an East India Company merchantman, and narrowly escaped. The Peacock headed in one direction and the Hornet in another. But the Cornwallis pursued the Hornet, and she only escaped by throwing overboard heavy equipment, including her guns. No longer useful as a warship, the Hornet made her way home, while the Peacock rounded the Cape of Good Hope to continue the mission. the U.S. frigate Constitution unknowingly delayed the construction of the Cornwallis in India when it captured the HM frigate Java that was bound for India with copper sheathing meant for her. Made of teak, the Cornwallis was built to last and saw a service of one kind or another until she was broken up in 1957. By June, Captain Lewis Warrington and the Peacock had reached the East Indies, where she took 3 prizes. Then, on June 30th, in the Sunda Straits off Java, the Peacock encountered the East India Company brig Nautilus that announced the war was over. Viewing this as a ruse, Captain Warrington opened fire. The Nautilus struck quickly, but only after sustaining considerable damage. The next morning, officials in Java confirmed what the Nautilus had stated, so the Americans left for home. After many years of diplomatic negotiation, the claims brought by the captured merchantmen and the Nautilus against the Peacock were finally settled in 1828. The naval war on blue water was over. The privateers, the other naval force. Privateers from all of the combating nations played a very important role in the War of 1812, a fact that is not appreciated in large part because the whole role of privateers as a legitimate part of warfare disappeared in the course of the 19th century among world maritime powers, and many people have a vague notion that it is somehow related to piracy and therefore nothing to be proud about. Both involved seizing private property, but one was legitimate and profitable, while the other was illegal and carried the death penalty. Governments authorize individuals, privateers, with a license or letter of marque and reprisal to capture enemy vessels, usually merchantmen, and bring them before an admiralty court where they would be condemned and thereafter could be legitimately sold. To ensure the privateer played by the rules and did not begin behaving like a pirate, he was required to post a surety bond, usually in sizable denominations, $5,000 to $10,000, that the government held. The privateer and the government made money when the condemned property was sold. The government took a portion of the proceeds, and the rest was split among the privateer captain and crew and those who invested in the privateer vessel. Thus, unlike piracy that was universally condemned, privateering was both profitable and patriotic, for they were doing the government's bidding. Estimates vary according to different sources and means of calculation, but about 1,800 merchantmen were seized by American privateers in the course of the 2.5-year war, or an average of 2 per day. Many of these were recaptured, so the net figure is probably more like 1,300, but this compares to about 250 taken by the U.S. Navy during this period. Even though the Navy outperformed the average privateer by more than 3 to 1, on average each Navy ship captured over 10 ships, while the privateers brought in less than 3. What is strategically important is the total number of ships the privateers took. Then consider the fact that an estimated 30,000 prisoners were taken at sea by American privateers and the Navy, 5 times as many as taken on land by the Army. Disruption to commerce was enormous, and the British, French, and Canadians were just as active against the Americans. The pennant, "Catch Me Who Can," best describes these high-flying, fast-to-windward privateer ships. They sought to avoid, not fight, enemy warships. Money was the mission, not war. Some privateers were legendary in their financial success, like James DeWolf, Captain Jim of Rhode Island, a former slave trader and successful business entrepreneur whose privateering made him one of the richest men in America. He took his swift former slaver brigantine, the Yankee, on 6 cruises in the course of the war and captured over 40 vessels worth more than $3 million. This was big money. The smallest share of just one of these cruises went to a black cabin boy, Jack Jibsheet, and amounted to far more than the 1812 war hero Oliver Hazard Perry earned in a full year. The best privateer vessels were designed to outrun any adversary and even go into an enemy's escorted convoy and cut out merchantmen. The famous Thomas Boyle's Chasseur 16, known as the Pride of Baltimore, is a good example. The Chasseur not only racked up an impressive list of captures and escaped repeated attempts by the Royal Navy to capture her, but she did so at England's doorstep. The audacious Boyle further infuriated the British and drove their insurance rates even higher when he sent a proclamation on a captured merchantman to be posted on the door of the famous maritime insurance company, Lloyd's of London. Since international maritime law stated that one could not formally proclaim a blockade unless one had the wherewithal to enforce it, Boyle's proclamation was a slap in Britain's face, for it equated his pronouncement and hence ability to enforce it with that of the British to enforce their announced blockade of all American ports. There are many colorful stories about American privateers. One in particular is remembered for fighting valor as well as financial success. The brigantine Prince de Neufchâtel, 17, sailing under Captain John Ordronaux, was becalmed the night of October 11, 1814, off the shoals of Nantucket, when the HM frigate Endymion, 40, under Captain Henry Hope, spotted her and sent 120 men in 5 barges under the cover of darkness to board and take her. The 20 minutes of fierce fighting that ensued were probably the bloodiest of the war. The British lost 49 killed, 37 wounded, and 30 taken prisoner, 116 of the original 120. The Yankee crew of 37 suffered over 80% casualties, 7 killed and 24 wounded. To put this in perspective, 3 months after this fight occurred, the Endymion engaged and with the eventual assistance of other frigates captured the U.S. frigate President 44. During that 2.5-hour duel, the British Endymion suffered 25 casualties versus a figure nearly 5 times that delivered by the crew of the much smaller Prince de Neufchâtel. In the closing days of the war, the British finally captured the Prince, but only because she sprung her masts while trying to outrun 3 frigates, the Acasta, Leander, and Newcastle. Another successful American privateer, also remembered for valiancy and courage, was the 14-gun brig General Armstrong. Some argue that in her final battle, her dogged resistance to British attacks tipped the scales of the history of the War of 1812, even though she was unaware of having done so. Under a very capable Captain Samuel Chester Reed, the General Armstrong sailed from New York City in September 1814, and on September 25th, put in at the neutral port of Faial in the Portuguese Azores to take on water and provisions. On the 26th, a squadron of British ships under Captain Robert Lloyd, including the HMS Plantagenet 74, HM frigate Rhoda 38, and HM brig Carnation 18, arrived at Faial to rendezvous with 2 other British frigates coming from Spain, the Thais and Calypso. The 5 ships were carrying artillery, troops, and ammunition as part of the large-scale attack on New Orleans planned for later that fall. It happened that the British commander, Captain Lloyd, had a passionate distaste for privateers and, although Faial was a neutral port and thus he could not attack the General Armstrong, he could not resist. That was his first mistake because the American, with its battery of long 9-pounders and its 1 Long Tom cannon, beat back the first attack of British boats while inflicting considerable loss. At midnight, a larger flotilla, this time a dozen armed barges with up to 400 men, attacked the 90 men of the American brig. Although the attackers breached the boarding nets and boarded the bow of the General Armstrong, the Americans rallied under Captain Reed and drove them off with considerable loss of life and barges. This only infuriated the British commander, who ordered the Carnation to close with the American. Not only were more British sailors lost, but their ship was badly damaged and retreated. Records vary, but the Americans lost 3 killed and several wounded, while the British reportedly suffered 65 killed and 117 wounded. As the new day dawned, the British were determined to eradicate the American nuisance, and, seeing the handwriting on the wall and vastly outgunned, Captain Reed landed his men and weapons on shore, scuttled the brig, and fortified an abandoned castle, daring the British to further violate the laws of neutrality by attacking on land. They did not. The British frigates from Spain arrived, but, contrary to the plan to sail immediately to New Orleans, they were ordered to transport the many wounded while repairs were made to the damaged Carnation. In all, about 3 weeks were lost because of the General Armstrong diversion. As shall be seen later, General Andrew Jackson arrived in New Orleans just days before the British and rushed to organize its defenses. Had the General Armstrong not put up such a fight, who knows how well General Jackson would have done at New Orleans. This is a production of the American Society of Marine Artists, the nation's leading professional, educational, not-for-profit marine art organization, made possible with the assistance of the United States Navy, United States Marines, and the United States Coast Guard, in conjunction with other leading national and international institutions, museums, and historical societies.